He built America's financial system from scratch, yet died broke. Alexander Hamilton was one of the most brilliant minds of the founding era, but his life ended in a bloody duel over pride and politics. Long before the wars, the politics, and the power, there was an island. Quiet, humid, swept by salt and wind. Nevis, in the British West Indies, sat small and almost invisible on the map of the world. But in the mid-18th century, that's where one of history's sharpest minds was born, Alexander Hamilton. Or maybe not. You see, even his birth is a riddle. Some records say he was born in 1755. Others insist it was 1757. Alexander himself sometimes seemed unsure, or perhaps he wanted to forget. What we do know is that he was born into nothing. His mother, Rachel Fawcett, was of French Huguenot descent. She had once been married to a Danish merchant, but that relationship crumbled. Her divorce wasn't recognized by the church, so when she began a relationship with James Hamilton, Alexander's father, it was considered scandalous. They were never legally married, which made young Alexander illegitimate. That word carried weight back then. Heavy weight. It meant doors closed before you could knock. It meant whispers in the street. It meant shame you didn't earn, but had to carry. Alexander grew up surrounded by economic hardship. His father struggled to find steady work. His mother, although resourceful and determined, couldn't shield him from poverty. The family moved from Nevis to St. Croix, trying to build a life, but bad luck followed them like a shadow. When Alexander was around 11, James Hamilton abandoned the family, likely ashamed and unable to provide. 2 years later, Rachel died of a fever, likely yellow fever, leaving Alexander and his older brother orphans. Just like that, everything was gone. Alexander was barely a teenager. He had no father, no mother, no inheritance, no title. But he had two things that would carry him further than any noble name could: his mind and his pen. And while the world saw just another colonial orphan, small, skinny, and forgettable, Alexander Hamilton was already quietly preparing to prove them all wrong. Because sometimes the people with the least end up doing the most. After his mother's death, young Alexander Hamilton was left with little more than her name and the burden of survival. He and his brother were taken in by a cousin, Peter Lytton, but that refuge didn't last. Within a year, Lytton died by suicide. Alexander was once again homeless. Not yet 14, he had no stable shelter, no family to lean on, and no education beyond the basics his mother had managed to give him. He found work as a clerk at an import-export firm run by a merchant named Beekman and Kruger on the island of St. Croix. It wasn't glamorous. He handled invoices, tracked cargo, calculated currency exchanges, and kept ledgers. But for a boy with a hungry mind, it was a school in itself. Day by day, Alexander absorbed the rhythms of commerce, learning how the world really worked, not in textbooks, but in ships and sugar and debt. He was trusted, efficient, and sharp. By the time he was 15, he was left in charge of the entire business when the owner was away. Think about that. Most teenagers couldn't be trusted to sweep a floor properly. Alexander was managing trade routes. But the sea air wasn't filled with opportunity. It was thick with slavery, economic despair, and colonial hierarchy. Alexander saw it all up close, and he hated it. He started writing. His letters were thoughtful, observant, sometimes poetic. They weren't just teenage ramblings. They had power, structure, and vision. He'd write about hurricanes as if describing a god's fury. He'd discuss politics, faith, morality. Then came the storm. In 1772, a hurricane tore through St. Croix. It ravaged buildings, sank ships, and left the island gasping. In the aftermath, Hamilton wrote a detailed account of the disaster for the local newspaper. But it wasn't just a news report, it was art. A 15-year-old boy described wind and water with the grace of a novelist and the insight of a philosopher. Local leaders read the piece and were stunned. Who was this boy? How did he write like that? They passed around his essay. They started whispering, then they started collecting donations. The people of St. Croix, impoverished and rebuilding, gathered enough money to send this orphan boy to America. because even in darkness, genius glows. In the fall of 1772, Alexander Hamilton left the Caribbean behind. He boarded a ship bound for the American colonies, clutching the hopes of the people who believed in him and the burden of becoming someone who mattered. He was just a teenager, barely 16, possibly younger, but he already carried himself like a man racing time. When he arrived in Boston and later made his way to New York, the world looked completely different. Crowded streets, churches, dockyards, colleges. This wasn't St. Croix. This was chaos, opportunity, fire. He enrolled at King's College, what we now know as Columbia University. It was one of the finest schools in the colonies, and Hamilton wasted no time. He devoured books like a starving man. He studied law, philosophy, economics, political theory, anything and everything. But learning wasn't enough, not for him. He wanted to speak. He wanted to write. And more than anything, he wanted to shape the world around him. The colonies, meanwhile, were teetering on the edge of revolution. Tensions with Britain had reached a boiling point. Taxes, soldiers, tyranny. The streets pulsed with the electricity of rebellion, and Hamilton stepped right into it. He started writing political essays under pseudonyms, defending the colonists' right to resist British rule. Readers thought the author must be a seasoned scholar or a high-ranking official. When they found out it was a teenager, they couldn't believe it. Soon, Hamilton began giving speeches in public squares, fiery, bold, overflowing with ideas. He wasn't just echoing popular slogans, he was thinking ahead, imagining a new kind of government, a new kind of future, and people noticed. New York was full of revolutionaries, but Hamilton stood out. He wasn't from the elite families. He had no pedigree, but he had something better, vision, and the fearless conviction to share it. He drilled with a militia in his free time, trained for war while he studied law, and wrote with the weight of a man twice his age. To some, he was brilliant, to others, arrogant. But no one could ignore him. America had just met Alexander Hamilton, and Alexander Hamilton had just found his battlefield. By the early 1770s, the colonies weren't just complaining anymore. They were preparing to fight. The British Crown had tightened its grip with taxes, troops, and proclamations. And while some men hesitated, others stood up. Alexander Hamilton was one of them. Still a student at King's College, Hamilton couldn't sit still. He joined a New York volunteer militia called the Hearts of Oak. They were young, mostly students, and woefully inexperienced. But what they lacked in training, they made up for in passion. Each morning before sunrise, Hamilton drilled with his comrades in a graveyard beside Trinity Church. They trained with borrowed weapons, learned the basics of formation, and studied British military tactics. At night, he buried himself in books, classics, strategy, economics, philosophy. Day and night, mind and body, Hamilton was preparing for something big. In 1775, when war officially broke out with the battles of Lexington and Concord, Hamilton was ready. He helped lead a daring raid on a British battery in Manhattan, stealing cannons under enemy fire. It was bold, dangerous, and successful, exactly the kind of act that caught attention. Hamilton's leadership was unmistakable. He wasn't just a writer anymore. He was now a soldier, and a good one. Within months, he earned a commission as captain of an artillery company. It was a rare position for someone so young and without connections. But Hamilton had proved himself in both word and action. His company saw action in several key battles, including the Battle of Princeton, where Hamilton's guns helped secure a pivotal victory for the Continental Army. His skill didn't go unnoticed. Commanders praised his discipline and organization. His troops respected him, and news of a brilliant young artillery captain with a silver tongue and steel nerves began to spread. But someone else had noticed too, someone who would change Hamilton's life forever. General George Washington. Washington, commander of the Continental Army, was constantly on the lookout for men who could think, lead, and act under pressure. And in Alexander Hamilton, he found all three. Hamilton had no way of knowing, but his days as a frontline officer were numbered. He was about to be called somewhere even more powerful than the battlefield. He was about to step inside the war room of a revolution. In 1777, something unexpected happened. Alexander Hamilton, barely in his 20s, commanding an artillery unit with growing respect, received an invitation. General George Washington wanted him, not as a field commander, but as part of his inner military staff. At first glance, it might have seemed like a step backward. Hamilton loved the battlefield. He thrived on action, movement, and strategy under fire. But this was different. This was Washington. And this offer wasn't a demotion. It was a doorway into the very heart of the revolution. Hamilton accepted. Washington made him an aide-de-camp, a kind of chief of staff. But in truth, he was far more than a glorified secretary. He became Washington's most trusted advisor, writing letters, orders, and diplomatic messages, many in Washington's voice. Hamilton's pen never stopped moving. His words carried authority, clarity, and purpose. He corresponded with generals, governors, and Congress. When orders needed to be obeyed, Hamilton's letters made sure they were. His writing was as sharp as his thinking, and he worked day and night, often by candlelight, with stacks of parchment and ink-stained hands. Washington relied on him for more than paperwork. Hamilton became a voice in his ear, a strategist, a sounding board. Despite the massive difference in age and status, there was mutual respect. Washington saw in Hamilton something rare, brilliance without hesitation. But Hamilton, despite his loyalty, still craved more. He didn't want to be remembered as just a writer. He yearned to lead men in battle again, to earn personal glory on the field, not just behind a desk. Multiple times he asked Washington for a combat command. Multiple times Washington denied him, not out of punishment, but because he couldn't afford to lose him. The tension quietly simmered between them. Washington treated him like a son. Hamilton sometimes chafed at the boundaries, but they needed each other. During these years, Hamilton also forged connections with powerful allies, including Lafayette, John Lawrence, and other revolutionary thinkers. His ideas were expanding. He wasn't just fighting a war, he was dreaming of what came after it. A new nation, a government that actually worked, a future he could help design. He was still young, still ambitious, and still just getting started. For 4 long years, Alexander Hamilton served faithfully at George Washington's side. He drafted letters that held armies together, organized supply chains during brutal winters, and helped Washington navigate the fragile egos of generals and politicians. His work was vital, there was no denying that. But inside, a fire still burned. Hamilton wanted the battlefield. He didn't just want to write about war, he wanted to fight it. He saw glory in military leadership, in leading charges, in commanding respect, not just for his intellect, but for his bravery. He'd proven himself before, back when he stole cannons under enemy fire and rallied artillery units in battle. But now, confined to paperwork and politics, he felt caged. He asked Washington repeatedly for a field command. Washington declined, repeatedly. To Washington, Hamilton was irreplaceable in his current role. He was efficient, brilliant, and dependable. While other aides came and went, Hamilton stayed. And Washington, often isolated, relied on him like few others. But Hamilton saw things differently. Each time another officer earned a battlefield promotion, each time someone else received the praise and recognition he craved, resentment quietly grew. Hamilton wasn't just hungry for action, he was hungry for legacy. He didn't want to be remembered as a behind-the-scenes figure. He wanted his own legend. The tension reached a breaking point in early 1781. After a minor misunderstanding, Hamilton kept Washington waiting outside a room for just a few minutes. Washington snapped. He rebuked Hamilton sharply, and Hamilton, already simmering with frustration, resigned from his staff position soon after. It was bold. Some might say reckless. But for Hamilton, it was a necessary gamble. He had served loyally. He had earned trust. And now he would take his fate into his own hands. Still, even after resigning, he didn't abandon the cause. He remained connected to the army, continued writing, and kept pushing for a command of his own. And finally, that chance came. Later that year, Washington offered him what he had waited for, his own battalion. The war wasn't over yet. and neither was Alexander Hamilton's climb toward greatness. The pen had served him well, but now it was time to lead with the sword. After years of waiting, writing, and proving himself behind the scenes, Alexander Hamilton finally received what he'd been chasing, command of his own battalion. It was the spring of 1781. The American Revolution was grinding into its final decisive stages, and all signs were pointing toward Yorktown, Virginia. There, British General Cornwallis had dug in with thousands of troops, waiting for reinforcements from the sea. What he didn't know was that the Franco-American alliance was about to strike with full force. Washington and French General Rochambeau planned to march their armies south for one final blow. Hamilton, with his newly earned command, would march with them. As the siege of Yorktown began in September, Hamilton's moment came into focus. The plan was risky, a nighttime assault on British Redoubt No. 10, one of two key fortifications protecting Cornwallis's position. If they could take it, the siege would tip in America's favor. Washington trusted Hamilton to lead the charge. October 14, 1781. The night was moonless, thick with tension. Hamilton's men crept toward the redoubt with bayonets fixed, rifles unloaded. Silence was essential. No gunfire, just steel and fury. And then they struck. Hamilton led the attack from the front. He climbed over the enemy defenses under a storm of musket fire, sword in hand, rallying his men forward. Within 10 minutes, 10 brutal, breathless minutes, the redoubt was theirs. The victory at Redoubt 10, paired with the simultaneous French success at Redoubt 9, broke the British lines. Within days, Cornwallis surrendered. The war, for all practical purposes, was over. For Hamilton, that night was more than just a battle, it was vindication. He had proven he was more than a writer, more than a political mind. He had led troops under fire and won. He was still in his early 20s, yet he had already shaped the war from both the desk and the front lines. He had earned Washington's respect once again, this time not just as an aide, but as a warrior. But the battlefield was only the beginning. Now that independence was nearly won, the question became, what next? What kind of nation would rise from the ashes of war? For Hamilton, the answer was clear. If America was going to survive, someone had to build it, and he was ready to start laying the foundation. When the guns fell silent and the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, the United States of America was officially free. But freedom, Hamilton quickly realized, was only the beginning. The country was independent, but not stable. The Articles of Confederation, the first attempt at a national government, were weak, toothless, and dangerously inefficient. The states operated more like competing countries than a united nation. They printed their own money, set their own rules, and squabbled endlessly over borders, taxes, and trade. To Hamilton, it was chaos masquerading as liberty. He left the army and returned to civilian life in New York, where he officially began his career as a lawyer. But his mind was still on the battlefield. Only now, the enemy wasn't redcoats. It was disorder, economic instability, and a lack of federal power. Hamilton believed deeply in structure, in systems, in a central government strong enough to hold the country together. And he feared that without it, everything they had just fought for would collapse. So he started writing again. He wrote essays, letters, and proposals. He joined state political circles, speaking passionately about the need for change. His voice, once used to rally troops, was now used to rally minds. In 1786, he helped organize the Annapolis Convention, a meeting meant to address the country's commercial problems. Only 5 states showed up, and nothing much happened, on the surface. But Hamilton used the opportunity to push for something bigger, a full constitutional convention to overhaul the government from the ground up. He got his wish. The following year, delegates from all 13 states gathered in Philadelphia, among them George Washington, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, and Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was one of the youngest in the room, but his energy was unmatched. His speeches were bold. His ideas were unapologetically pro-federalist. He believed America needed a strong central government, a national economy, and a unified identity. Not everyone agreed. In fact, many were wary of centralized power. It reminded them too much of monarchy. But Hamilton didn't back down. He wasn't just fighting for a constitution, he was fighting for a vision of America that could last. Because revolutions may win freedom, but only structure can keep it. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 was a turning point for America and for Alexander Hamilton. For 4 hot months in Philadelphia, delegates debated, argued, and rewrote the blueprint for a new government. And while Hamilton wasn't the loudest voice in the room, he was one of the most unshakably determined. His vision was ambitious, some said too much so. Hamilton argued for a strong central government, a president with real executive power, and even a Senate that served for life. These ideas didn't sit well with many of the delegates, who had just thrown off a king and weren't keen on anything that smelled like monarchy. In the end, Hamilton's more extreme proposals weren't adopted, but many of his broader principles, strong federal authority, a robust executive branch, and the supremacy of national law, made it into the final constitution. Still, the fight was far from over. The constitution had been written, yes, but it still needed to be ratified by the states. And that wouldn't be easy. Opposition was fierce, especially from people who feared losing state power or saw the new federal system as a threat to individual liberty. So, Hamilton went to war again, not with guns, but with his greatest weapon, his pen. He joined forces with James Madison and John Jay to write a series of essays defending the new constitution. Published under the shared pseudonym Publius, these essays were aimed at ordinary citizens, clear, logical, and persuasive. Hamilton wrote the majority of them, 51 out of the 85 essays, sometimes drafting several per week, late into the night, by candlelight. These became the Federalist Papers. Each essay tackled a different question. Why do we need a stronger government? How will checks and balances protect freedom? Why should people trust a national judiciary? Hamilton poured his soul into these arguments. He wasn't just defending a document. He was defending the very future of the Republic. And it worked. Slowly, state by state, the Constitution was ratified. In 1789, it officially became the supreme law of the land. The United States now had a government. And Alexander Hamilton? He wasn't just one of its architects. He was about to become its chief engineer. In 1789, the new American government took its first breath. George Washington was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States. And when it came time to fill his cabinet with the sharpest minds in the country, he knew exactly who he wanted to manage the nation's finances: Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was sworn in as the first Secretary of the Treasury, a title that might have sounded bureaucratic, but in reality came with a staggering challenge. The United States was broke. There was no national currency, no central banking system, no public credit. The government owed millions in war debts to foreign allies, private citizens, and even its own soldiers. The economy was fractured, unstable, and teetering on collapse. To most, it seemed like a disaster. To Hamilton, it was an opportunity. He got to work immediately, drafting reports, crunching numbers, and designing a financial system from scratch. His goal? Not just to solve the present crisis, but to lay the foundation for a strong modern economy. His first move was bold. The federal government would assume all state debts from the Revolutionary War. This meant the national government would now owe money, not the individual states. Many saw this as dangerous. Hamilton saw it as brilliant. Why? Because if the federal government owed money, lenders, especially the wealthy elite, would have a vested interest in its survival. Next, he proposed the creation of a national bank, a central institution that could manage government funds, issue stable currency, and stimulate economic growth. He also introduced tariffs and taxes designed to protect American manufacturing and help generate revenue. To Hamilton, economics wasn't just about math. It was about power. He believed that a strong economy would lead to a strong nation, and that public credit, once restored, would attract investment, create jobs, and elevate the United States on the global stage. But not everyone shared his vision. His policies triggered fierce opposition, especially from Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who feared that Hamilton was creating an elite, centralized government too similar to Britain's monarchy. Still, Washington backed him. And slowly but surely, Hamilton's ideas took root. The US economy began to stabilize. Confidence grew. The dollar gained value. In just a few years, Hamilton had taken a bankrupt, fractured collection of states and given it the beating heart of a functioning economy. He wasn't just managing money, he was building a nation. As Alexander Hamilton's financial system began to take shape, so did his reputation, not just as a brilliant architect of the economy, but as a polarizing force in American politics. To his supporters, Hamilton was a genius, a man who turned chaos into order and gave the young nation a real future. But to his critics, he was dangerous, too bold, too centralized, too British in style, with his talk of national banks, strong executives, and urban industry. And no critic was louder or more persistent than Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, the Secretary of State, was Hamilton's opposite in nearly every way. Where Hamilton believed in cities, commerce, and concentrated federal power, Jefferson believed in rural life, individual liberty, and limited government. He saw America as a land of farmers and freedom, not financiers and federal banks. The two men couldn't have disagreed more. To Jefferson, Hamilton's national bank was unconstitutional. His debt plan was a favor to the wealthy. His tariffs and taxes, a burden on the common man. He believed Hamilton was steering the country toward a dangerous aristocracy, where elites ruled and liberty suffered. To Hamilton, Jefferson was naive. His vision of an agrarian paradise ignored economic reality. Without credit, without industry, without structure, Hamilton believed the nation would crumble. The clash was more than philosophical. It became personal. Each man had allies. Jefferson had Madison, and Hamilton had Washington's ear. Their disagreements turned the cabinet into a war zone. Washington, though respectful of Jefferson, often sided with Hamilton. He valued results, and Hamilton delivered them. Still, the feud grew. In the press, Jefferson's allies accused Hamilton of corruption and tyranny. In return, Hamilton's supporters painted Jefferson as weak and idealistic. What began as debate quickly hardened into rivalry and eventually birthed something new in American history: political parties. Hamilton's followers became known as the Federalists, Jefferson's the Democratic Republicans. The country, still young and fragile, was now splitting into factions. It wasn't what the Founding Fathers had wanted, but it was what the moment demanded. And right in the center of it all stood Alexander Hamilton, praised, hated, unstoppable. He had built an economy. Now, unknowingly, he had helped build the machinery of American politics. The United States had barely found its footing before it began to divide, not by geography, but by ideology. And at the heart of this division stood two powerful opposing minds, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton never intended to start a political party, but his policies, national debt consolidation, a central bank, manufacturing support, and a strong executive, were radical enough to make him a symbol of a broader political movement. His followers, urban merchants, financiers, lawyers, and many war veterans, rallied around his ideas. They called themselves Federalists. On the other side, Jefferson and James Madison spoke to farmers, artisans, and states' rights advocates. They feared that Hamilton's version of government would turn the republic into an oligarchy ruled by banks and elites. They formed what would become the Democratic Republican Party. This was the birth of America's first party system. The press, which had once focused on foreign affairs and commerce, now became weaponized. Partisan newspapers sprang up like wildfire. Hamilton's allies wrote fiery editorials defending central authority and financial discipline. Jefferson's camp countered with blistering critiques, accusing Hamilton of betraying the revolution by building a system that benefited the rich. Hamilton, ever combative, gave as good as he got. He wrote under pseudonyms, leaked damaging letters, and used his incredible skill with language to shape public opinion. He wasn't just managing policy, he was managing narratives. Washington, who deeply disliked factionalism, grew increasingly uncomfortable. He had hoped that his presidency would set a tone of unity. But by the end of his second term, the cabinet was a political battlefield, and the nation a house divided. Eventually, Jefferson resigned from Washington's cabinet, disgusted by Hamilton's influence. But even in resignation, his movement grew stronger. And then came the election of 1796, America's first real contested presidential race. John Adams, a Federalist, won. But Jefferson, his opponent, became vice president under the rules of the time. It was an awkward, tense administration. And Hamilton, although no longer in the cabinet, still pulled strings from behind the curtain. The Revolution had created a nation, but Hamilton and Jefferson had created something longer lasting, the template for American political conflict. Ideas versus power, cities versus farms, central versus local, and the fight was far from over. Alexander Hamilton had built a reputation as a man of brilliance, order, and discipline. But in 1797, that image would shatter. It all began several years earlier, during the summer of 1791. Hamilton, then the Secretary of the Treasury and one of the most powerful men in the country, was approached at home by a young woman named Maria Reynolds. She claimed her husband had abandoned her and asked Hamilton for financial help. He agreed, but what followed wasn't charity. It was an affair. Hamilton and Maria Reynolds began a secret relationship that lasted for months. But it wasn't just an affair. It turned into a trap. Her husband, James Reynolds, found out and blackmailed Hamilton, demanding money to keep silent. Rather than end the affair immediately, Hamilton continued to pay and continued to see Maria. Eventually, the situation unraveled. In 1797, political enemies, including Thomas Jefferson's allies, uncovered the payments. They suspected Hamilton was involved in financial corruption, using government funds improperly. In reality, the payments were personal, not political, but Hamilton knew the story would explode. So he did something almost unthinkable. He told the truth. In a 95-page public document, now known as the Reynolds pamphlet, Hamilton confessed to the entire affair in shocking detail. He admitted to adultery, to the blackmail payments, and to the personal disgrace it brought, but he denied any financial misconduct in his public office. It was the first major sex scandal in American political history, and it ruined him. Public reaction was brutal. Some were stunned by his honesty. Others repelled by the behavior itself. His enemies used it as proof that Hamilton was immoral and unfit for public life. Even his allies were shaken. His once sterling reputation took a permanent hit. At home, things were even worse. His wife, Eliza, was devastated. The woman who had supported him through war, scandal, and politics now had to endure public humiliation. Hamilton never recovered politically. Though he continued to write and advise, he would never hold public office again. The man who built America's financial foundation had destroyed his credibility with one private mistake. His enemies cheered. But Hamilton, he wrote on, because no matter how deep the scandal, he still believed in shaping the future. After the publication of the Reynolds pamphlet, Alexander Hamilton's world changed. He had exposed himself, not just to save his public integrity, but to own his mistake. But honesty, as it turned out, came at a steep price. The American public was shocked. Many couldn't believe that the architect of the nation's economy, the man once whispered about with admiration, had fallen into such a personal scandal. The whispers turned into headlines, and the headlines turned into laughter. Political opponents pounced. Jeffersonian newspapers had a field day, portraying Hamilton as a corrupt hypocrite, a man who claimed to build a moral republic while living a double life. His affair with Maria Reynolds was used not just to attack his character, but to discredit everything he stood for. Among Federalists, the reaction was mixed. Some admired his honesty, saying it proved he had nothing to hide. Others saw a liability, a man who, despite his brilliance, couldn't control himself. But perhaps the most painful reaction came from within his own home. Eliza Hamilton, his wife, had been his fiercest defender for years. Through war, politics, and public pressure, she had stood by him. But this time, Hamilton had betrayed her trust in the most public way possible. The damage to their marriage was deep and personal. Still, she didn't leave him. And Hamilton, wounded but not silenced, continued to write. He may have lost public favor, but he had not lost his sense of duty. He remained an influential voice behind the scenes. During the contentious presidential election of 1800, Hamilton, no longer in office, tried to shape the outcome anyway. Although he was a Federalist, Hamilton did not trust President John Adams, the head of his own party. The two men had grown to despise each other. So, in a move that shocked even his allies, Hamilton publicly attacked Adams in a scathing pamphlet, calling him unstable and unfit for office. It was political suicide. The attack fractured the Federalist Party and opened the door for Thomas Jefferson to win the presidency. Hamilton had intended to steer the outcome, but ended up sinking his own side. He had once controlled America's finances. Now he was an outsider in a country he helped build. Yet even in exile, Hamilton couldn't help himself. He kept writing, because that's what Hamilton did. He fought, he failed, and he never stayed quiet. By the turn of the 19th century, Alexander Hamilton's influence had faded. He no longer held public office, the Federalist Party was splintered, and his personal reputation, still scarred from the Reynolds scandal, kept him on the fringes of power. But if Hamilton was drifting from the center of politics, someone else was quickly stepping into it. Aaron Burr. Sharp, ambitious, and unpredictable, Burr was a man Hamilton had never trusted. The two had crossed paths in New York politics for years. Burr was charismatic, calculating, and well-connected. He could charm a crowd just as easily as he could undercut an opponent. To Hamilton, Burr was dangerous, not because of what he believed, but because he seemed to believe in nothing. In the election of 1800, the rivalry between Burr and Hamilton deepened. Burr ran as Thomas Jefferson's running mate on the Democratic-Republican ticket. But due to a quirk in the Electoral College system at the time, both Jefferson and Burr received the same number of electoral votes. A tie. The decision went to the House of Representatives, and Hamilton, though no friend to Jefferson, made a stunning choice. He backed Jefferson. In letters and conversations with Federalist representatives, Hamilton argued that while he disagreed with Jefferson's politics, at least Jefferson had principles. Burr, in Hamilton's eyes, had none. Burr loves nothing but himself, he wrote. He is as ambitious and unprincipled as he is dangerous. It was a critical move. Jefferson was selected as president. Burr became vice president, but he knew exactly who had cost him the top seat. Hamilton had made a powerful enemy, and Burr never forgot. Over the next few years, Burr's political fortunes declined. He was sidelined during Jefferson's presidency and eventually found himself isolated, much like Hamilton. But unlike Hamilton, Burr was not content to fade quietly. The tension between the two men smoldered. Through letters, speeches, and political maneuvering, Hamilton continued to publicly insult Burr's character. He warned anyone who would listen that Burr posed a threat to the Republic. It wasn't just politics anymore, it was personal. Two men, two careers in decline, and one final confrontation creeping closer. Neither of them knew it yet, but the fuse had already been lit, and it would explode in blood. By 1804, the political landscape had changed. Again. Thomas Jefferson was in his second term as president, and Aaron Burr, still serving as vice president, was now completely cut off from the power he once tasted. Rejected from Jefferson's inner circle and politically stranded, Burr set his sights on a new opportunity, the governorship of New York. It was a chance to reclaim relevance, to reset the game. But Alexander Hamilton, never one to stay silent, refused to let that happen. Throughout Burr's campaign, Hamilton worked behind the scenes to block him. He wrote letters to influential figures, urging them not to support Burr. He warned that Burr was corrupt, unpredictable, and unworthy of trust. The most unfit and dangerous man of the community, Hamilton called him. It was political sabotage. And it worked. Burr lost the election. Publicly humiliated and privately enraged, Burr blamed one man for his defeat, Alexander Hamilton. Shortly afterward, a letter was published in a newspaper. In it, Dr. Charles Cooper, a friend of Hamilton's, described Hamilton's opinion of Burr at a private dinner. According to Cooper, Hamilton had said things still more despicable about Burr than what had been published. That was it. Burr demanded a retraction. Hamilton refused. He admitted to criticizing Burr's political conduct, but not to calling him despicable. That, he said, was hearsay. But Burr didn't want a clarification. He wanted a reckoning. So he sent a letter, a formal challenge, a duel. At first, Hamilton hesitated. Dueling was illegal, dangerous, and against his own moral beliefs. He had lost friends to duels. He had spoken against them publicly. He had a family. He had sons. He had a legacy. But he also had pride. Hamilton feared that rejecting the challenge would brand him a coward. He believed that honor mattered, and so he accepted. He began to put his affairs in order. He wrote a letter to Eliza, expressing his love. He drafted a statement explaining that he intended to throw away his shot, not to kill, but to preserve honor without bloodshed. But duels didn't always go according to plan. On the morning of July 11, 1804, Hamilton and Burr would meet on the cliffs of Weehawken, New Jersey. 2 men, 2 pistols, and one final moment that would change American history forever. The sun had barely risen on July 11, 1804, when 2 boats quietly slipped across the Hudson River from Manhattan to the wooded bluffs of Weehawken, New Jersey. The sky was pale, the air thick with mist. It was a place chosen deliberately, remote, hidden from the law, and stained with history. Just a few years earlier, Hamilton's own son, Philip, had died in a duel here. Now, Alexander Hamilton had returned to face his own end. He arrived with his second, Nathaniel Pendleton. Aaron Burr brought his own second, William Van Ness. The pistols were prepared, the distance was measured, 10 paces apart. Burr stood tall, composed. Hamilton, quiet but resolute. What exactly happened in the seconds that followed remains a mystery. Hamilton claimed beforehand that he intended to throw away his shot, to aim high, to avoid bloodshed, to meet the challenge without killing. Some accounts say he fired into the air, deliberately missing. Others believe he flinched or fired by reflex. But what isn't in question is what Burr did next. He raised his pistol. He fired. The bullet struck Hamilton in the lower abdomen, shattering his ribs, tearing through his liver, and lodging in his spine. He collapsed almost instantly. Burr, stunned by the damage, stepped forward, then turned and walked away. Hamilton was rushed back across the river, unconscious, bleeding, and barely alive. He was taken to the home of a friend in Greenwich Village, where his family soon gathered. He lived for 31 hours. During that time, he drifted in and out of consciousness. He spoke to his wife, Eliza, asked for forgiveness, and received last rites. His friends came to say goodbye. His children held his hand. And then, on the afternoon of July 12, 1804, Alexander Hamilton died. He was 47 years old. The man who had fought in the Revolution, built the nation's financial system, written the bulk of the Federalist Papers, and shaped the very structure of the United States, was gone. Killed in a duel that history would remember as a tragedy, a waste, and a final chapter written in gunpowder and pride. But Hamilton's story didn't end there, because death has a strange way of echoing, especially when a legacy refuses to be buried. As news of Alexander Hamilton's death spread across New York City, shock rippled through every corner of the young republic. Crowds gathered in silence outside his home. Federalists mourned the loss of their intellectual anchor. Even those who opposed him politically stood still, stunned by how suddenly and senselessly it had ended. Duels had claimed lives before, but this felt different. Here was a man who had helped win independence, built the U.S. economy, defended the Constitution, and shaped the very foundations of government, now gone by the hand of a sitting vice president. Public outrage flared. Hamilton's funeral drew thousands. Businesses closed. church bells rang. Soldiers marched alongside civilians in mourning. At Trinity Churchyard, his coffin was lowered into the ground beneath a simple stone. He was buried not as a politician, but as a patriot. His wife Eliza stood by his side until the very end. In the days after his death, Eliza faced a mountain of debts and 7 surviving children to raise. Yet she refused to break. Fueled by grief and love, she dedicated her life to preserving her husband's legacy and to finishing the work he had started. She helped establish the first private orphanage in New York, honoring Hamilton's own childhood as a poor, forgotten boy. She organized his letters, defended his name, and made sure the next generation knew who he was, not just as a founder, but as a father and a visionary. As for Aaron Burr, the man who fired the shot, he was never charged with murder, but his political career ended the moment Hamilton's heart stopped. He finished his term as vice president in disgrace, living the rest of his life as a man haunted by what he had done. Hamilton's death marked the end of one chapter in American politics and the beginning of another. The country moved forward, but Hamilton's ideas, central banking, public credit, strong federal authority, would endure. Decades later, leaders like Abraham Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt would cite Hamilton as a guidepost. And though his name faded for much of the 19th century, it would never disappear completely. Because Hamilton was more than a founding father. He was a builder, a believer, and a man whose last breath became the spark of something far greater than himself. In the wake of Alexander Hamilton's death, his wife, Eliza, stood at the crossroads of heartbreak and duty. She had lost her husband to pride and politics. Left behind were 7 children, a mountain of debt, and a legacy under siege. Many in society whispered about Hamilton's scandal, his duel, his arrogance. His enemies were eager to write him off. But Eliza refused to let history forget him. Born into the prominent Schuyler family, Eliza had always been strong. But now she had to be unbreakable. She sold their home, managed their remaining assets, and began the long, lonely work of protecting the reputation of a man who could no longer speak for himself. She gathered his writings, letters, essays, government reports. She tracked down his correspondences, organized his papers, and defended his role in the founding of the country. She corrected public misperceptions, shared stories with historians, and kept his name alive through deliberate, careful storytelling. But Eliza's mission didn't stop at memory. She also built. In 1806, just 2 years after Hamilton's death, Eliza helped establish the Orphan Asylum Society in New York City, what would eventually become the Graham Wyndham, one of the city's first orphanages. It was more than charity. It was personal. She never forgot that her husband had been an orphan himself, abandoned, impoverished, and overlooked. Through this work, she ensured that other children wouldn't be forgotten the way he had been. For the next 5 decades, Eliza lived not as a recluse, but as a quiet force behind American memory. She outlived her husband by 50 years, long enough to see some of his ideas finally recognized for their genius. When people asked her how she survived such tragedy, she would speak softly but firmly. "I had his children," she'd say. "I had his legacy." She died in 1854 at the age of 97. Nearly a century of life, half of it spent in devotion to a man no longer living, but whose influence refused to die. Eliza didn't just preserve Hamilton's story, she rescued it. Because even though the world had tried to bury him in scandal and silence, she gave him a second life, not in politics, but in memory. And because of her, the name Alexander Hamilton would not vanish from history. Alexander Hamilton may have died young, but his ideas were just getting started. In the early years after his death, his legacy remained tangled in controversy. To many, he was remembered as the brilliant mind who couldn't escape his own ego, a man who built a financial empire only to fall to scandal and violence. His critics still painted him as an elitist, a monarchist in disguise, someone too eager to concentrate power in government hands. But history, as it often does, began to shift. America grew, the economy expanded, industry rose, and slowly, leaders began to revisit Hamilton's vision, not with suspicion, but with respect. His blueprint for a strong central government became a model during national crises. His belief in federal credit became the cornerstone of American financial power, and his dream of a diverse, industrial economy came to life in the factories, railroads, and trade routes that shaped the 19th century. By the time the Civil War approached, Abraham Lincoln was reading Hamilton's writings closely. He saw Hamilton as a guide, a man who understood that preserving the Union required both principle and structure. Lincoln's financial strategies during the war reflected Hamilton's belief in a unified economic system supported by national credit. Even later, presidents like Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin D. Roosevelt would quote Hamilton in speeches, drawing on his ideas about executive strength, national infrastructure, and economic planning. Historians, too, began to change their tone. The once dismissed Federalist became, in hindsight, one of the most forward-thinking of all the Founding Fathers. He had seen a version of America that took over a century to fully arrive, and in many ways was still arriving. Hamilton's critics had often accused him of dreaming too big, but maybe that was the point. His vision was never meant for his time alone. It was meant to grow into the future, to outlive him, outlast him, and evolve as the country did. He died before he could see it. But his fingerprints were on everything: the banks, the courts, the Constitution, the very concept of a nation bound not by blood or region, but by ideas. Alexander Hamilton was no longer just a man. He was a philosophy in motion. As the 19th century rolled on, Alexander Hamilton's name began to fade. Other founding fathers rose to mythic status: George Washington, the noble general; Thomas Jefferson, the philosopher-president; Benjamin Franklin, the beloved genius. Their stories were retold in classrooms, statues, and textbooks. But Hamilton? He became a footnote. Part of the reason was political. His Federalist Party had long since vanished, absorbed or overtaken by new political movements. His enemies, Jeffersonians, Jacksonians, and others, controlled much of the public narrative in the decades following his death, and they weren't exactly eager to praise a man they saw as a threat to democracy. They called him arrogant, power-hungry, a man who cared more for bankers and industry than for the common man. And then there was the duel. In a young, idealistic republic, Hamilton's end, killed in a personal dispute by another politician, felt messy, almost shameful. It didn't fit the heroic narrative many Americans wanted to teach their children. So, over time, his memory softened. The Federalist Papers, once a cornerstone of constitutional debate, were still read, but often without much attention to the man behind most of them. His economic policies lived on in practice, but not in name. He became, quietly, the founder people forgot. But not everyone forgot. Legal scholars, economists, and historians kept digging into his work. Some praised his brilliance, his foresight, his ability to predict the needs of a nation still in its infancy. Others admired the raw determination of a man who rose from nothing, an illegitimate orphan from the Caribbean, into one of the most influential figures in American history. Even still, for most of the 19th and 20th centuries, Hamilton remained a second-tier figure, respected but not revered. His portrait was placed on the $10 bill, but few people gave it more than a passing glance. He had a statue or two, a few schools named in his honor, and a tomb in Trinity Church. But he wasn't celebrated the way Washington or Lincoln were. It seemed history had quietly tucked him away. But Hamilton had always been underestimated, and like he had done so many times before, he was quietly waiting for a chance to rise again. This time, not through politics, but through something no one saw coming. For nearly 2 centuries, Alexander Hamilton's story remained largely in the background of American memory, until one man picked up a book at an airport and everything changed. In 2004, historian Ron Chernow published a groundbreaking biography titled Alexander Hamilton. It was rich, detailed, and deeply humanizing. Instead of focusing only on policy or scandal, it painted a full picture of a complex man, flawed, brilliant, ambitious, relentless. A man who had risen from nothing to shape a nation. The book was praised by scholars, but it reached someone entirely unexpected, a young playwright and musician named Lin-Manuel Miranda. On vacation in Mexico, Miranda brought Chernow's biography along as light reading. By the second chapter, he was stunned. "This is the most hip-hop story I've ever read," he said. A poor kid from the Caribbean who used words to rise to the top. It didn't just resonate, it sounded like music. And so, Hamilton's second act began. Not in Congress, but on Broadway. In 2015, Miranda's musical Hamilton premiered at the Public Theater in New York City. A bold, genre-defying mix of hip-hop, R&B, and traditional show tunes, it reimagined the Founding Fathers as young, diverse, and deeply flawed revolutionaries. Hamilton, played by Miranda himself, was portrayed as a lyrical genius, a political fighter, and a man burning with purpose and insecurity. The show cast actors of color in the roles of America's founders, giving new voice and new relevance to an old story. Audiences were electrified. The show moved to Broadway later that year, earned a record-breaking 16 Tony Award nominations, won 11, and went on to win the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. It became a cultural phenomenon, pulling Hamilton's legacy out of dusty textbooks and into the hearts of millions. Suddenly, the world wanted to know, who was Alexander Hamilton? Students began reading the Federalist Papers. Visitors flocked to Trinity Church and the Hamilton Grange. Sales of Chernow's biography skyrocketed. And more than anything, people began to understand what Eliza Hamilton had fought so hard for, to make sure her husband's story was not forgotten. Hamilton had always believed in the power of words. Now, more than 200 years after his death, it was words and music that brought him roaring back to life. When Hamilton, an American musical, exploded onto the stage, it didn't just entertain, it educated. For many in the audience, especially younger generations, this was their first deep introduction to Alexander Hamilton. And not the Hamilton from old history books. The musical brought him to life with rhythm, emotion, and modern urgency. Suddenly, students were quoting Federalist number 10 in classrooms. History teachers were updating lesson plans. College courses began, including the lyrics alongside primary source documents. Museums saw surges in attendance. Even Google searches for Alexander Hamilton spiked into the millions. Hamilton had become cool. But it wasn't just about music or rhyme schemes. The story resonated because it was universal. Here was a man born out of wedlock, raised in poverty, an immigrant with no status or title who rose by the sheer power of his intellect, ambition, and resilience. His flaws, his pride, his temper, his insecurities were not hidden but explored. In many ways, Hamilton became a mirror for immigrants, for underdogs, for dreamers, for anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Lines like, "I am not throwing away my shot," or "Immigrants, we get the job done," became rallying cries. The themes of legacy, sacrifice, and the weight of history struck chords in a divided, uncertain world. And while the musical took creative liberties, as all dramatizations do, it sparked something rare. Genuine curiosity about the real man behind the melody. Historians, at first skeptical, began to applaud the phenomenon. It didn't replace academic study, but it opened doors. It got people asking questions. It brought forgotten stories into the light. The show's cultural impact even reached the highest levels of government. Former President Barack Obama called it a story about America then, told by America now. Tickets were gifted to students. The cast performed at the White House. More than 2 centuries after his death, Hamilton was not just remembered, he was relatable. In his own time, he often felt like an outsider, misunderstood, too bold, too fast, too much. But now, the world finally caught up, and the man once buried by scandal and politics now had history's full attention. Because once forgotten stories are told loud enough, they can echo through time. As the spotlight returned to Alexander Hamilton in the 21st century, people began to look at his ideas, not just his life, and realize something extraordinary. So much of what America is came from him. From the very beginning, Hamilton was thinking not just about independence, but about what came next. While others fought to break free from Britain, Hamilton focused on how to build something that would last. And many of the systems he envisioned, systems criticized in his own time, are now seen as foundational. Take the national economy. When Hamilton proposed the federal assumption of state debts and the creation of a national bank, critics screamed that it was tyranny in disguise. Today, those ideas are standard. America's credit system, the Treasury Department, and the very concept of public finance were all shaped by his blueprint. Then there's the Constitution. While others hesitated over its limitations, Hamilton helped sell it to the public with unmatched force. The Federalist Papers, which he wrote the bulk of, are still referenced in Supreme Court decisions today. His defense of strong federal authority laid the intellectual foundation for a united country. Even the executive branch, the power of the presidency, the role of the cabinet, and the checks between branches of government reflect Hamilton's influence. He feared mob rule just as much as monarchy, and he worked endlessly to balance liberty with law. He also envisioned America as a place not just of ideals, but of industry. He pushed for manufacturing, infrastructure, and innovation. In his famous report on manufacturers, he outlined a vision of an economic powerhouse, a nation that could stand on its own. At the time, many rejected it. Today, it reads like prophecy. Hamilton's legacy isn't just carved in marble or printed on currency. It lives in every debate about federal power, every discussion about debt and taxes, every policy decision that weighs liberty against responsibility. He saw government not as a threat, but as a tool that, when used wisely, could build a country strong enough to survive war, division, and time itself. 200 years later, we're still using that tool, still building, still following a blueprint drawn up by a man who never stopped working until history caught up with him. Alexander Hamilton's rise was remarkable, but it wasn't smooth. For all his brilliance, for all the systems he built, the papers he wrote, the battles he fought, Hamilton was never a perfect hero. In fact, what makes his story resonate today isn't just his success, but his flaws. Hamilton was often his own worst enemy. His pride, for starters, was enormous. He believed, often rightly, that he was the smartest man in the room. But that belief came at a cost. He insulted political allies, alienated colleagues, and when given the chance to stay quiet, he almost never did. Take the Reynolds affair. Many in his circle advised him to stay silent, let the rumors fade. Instead, he published a 95-page confession, publicly, in detail. To protect his political reputation, he torched his personal one. His need to be right, always, cost him more than he could afford. He also had a sharp temper. Words were his weapon, and he wielded them with surgical cruelty when provoked. His political writings were ruthless, even against fellow Federalists. His pamphlet, tearing apart John Adams, didn't just hurt Adams, it helped Jefferson win the presidency. That wasn't strategy, that was impulse. Hamilton also struggled with contradictions. He fought for liberty, yet helped create systems that concentrated power. He distrusted the masses, yet built mechanisms to protect their future. He was an immigrant who feared the instability of democracy, a champion of merit who often spoke like an aristocrat. And perhaps the deepest contradiction of all, he was a man obsessed with legacy, who died in a duel that almost erased it. And yet, isn't that what makes him relatable? Hamilton wasn't untouchable like Washington. He wasn't quietly calculating like Madison. He was loud, fiery, ambitious, and deeply human. He worked himself to the bone because he never felt secure. He pushed too hard because he feared being forgotten. He made mistakes because he refused to play safe. And that's why, centuries later, his story still speaks. Because Hamilton wasn't a legend carved in stone. He was flesh and blood, genius and flaw, a man who tried, failed, rose, fell, and kept going. He wasn't perfect. He was real. Legacies are strange things. Some are carved in stone, immediate, obvious, larger than life. Others are quieter, buried for a time, waiting for someone to dust them off and see them clearly. Alexander Hamilton's legacy lived somewhere in between. In his lifetime, he fought for influence. After his death, he faded into the background. But now, more than 200 years later, he's everywhere, in classrooms, theaters, political debates, and social movements. What makes his legacy so powerful today isn't just what he did, it's what he represents. He's the immigrant who built a nation's economy, the orphan who stood beside a general, the outsider who stepped into the core of power and refused to apologize for being bold. In a country built on opportunity, Hamilton's story is the ultimate proof that you don't need to be born into greatness to achieve it. But legacy, to Hamilton, was never about statues or songs. It was about impact. He once asked a haunting question, "What is a legacy?" It's planting seeds in a garden you never get to see. He didn't live to see his economic system flourish. He didn't see his constitution endure centuries. He didn't see his wife outlive him by 50 years or witness a Broadway musical about his life. He never saw young students quoting his essays in schools across the world, but those seeds, they grew. And in that way, his voice never really stopped speaking. You hear it every time someone defends the Constitution with logic and passion. You see it in systems that still hold the country together. You feel it in stories of people who rise from nothing, just like he did. Even in the face of death, Hamilton was thinking forward. His duel wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a final act of a man who understood the cost of legacy. He wrote letters, settled debts, prepared his family, and asked that his story not be lost. He was thinking of tomorrow, even as his time ran out. And now, centuries later, the garden he planted continues to bloom. Not because he was perfect, but because he refused to be forgotten. Alexander Hamilton's life was short, 47 years. But in those years, he lived more than most ever do. He rose from poverty, carved out a place in history with nothing but his mind and will, and left behind a legacy that helped shape an entire nation. He was never a president. He never led a state. But his fingerprints are on the Constitution, the financial system, the courts, the very idea of what it means to be a united nation. And yet, what makes Hamilton truly unforgettable isn't just what he built, it's how he built it. He failed publicly, he loved deeply, he fought passionately, he made enemies, mended friendships, and left a trail of letters that pulse with energy, urgency, and brilliance. He was a flawed man, jealous, stubborn, impulsive. But he was also endlessly driven. He believed in building something bigger than himself, even when it cost him everything. And maybe that's why, all these years later, we're still drawn to his story. Because we recognize it, the struggle to rise, the need to prove yourself, the tension between ambition and morality, the hope that your work, your words, might outlast you. His life reminds us that greatness isn't about perfection, it's about effort, about vision, about refusing to settle for the world as it is and daring to imagine the world as it could be. Hamilton imagined a future where America was strong, structured, and stable. And while he never got to see that future fully realized, he laid the foundation with fierce determination. He may not have thrown away his shot on that dueling ground, but through his work, his words, and his unwavering spirit, he gave the rest of us a shot at freedom, at structure, at possibility. And in the end, what more could you ask from a founding father? He was not made of marble or myth, he was made of ink, steel, and fire. So the next time you hold a $10 bill, remember the man who didn't come from money, didn't come from privilege, but gave everything he had to build a country that could outlive him. That's Alexander Hamilton. And now, you know his story.